second science presentation, and I'm trying to bring us in such a way that you don't get confused and intimidated by late 20th century science, because it really is massive and the complexities are phenomenal. We're taking two individuals, a man and a woman, as the focus. Mary Leakey and Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr, a physicist who dealt with the world of the very small, and Mary Leakey, a paleontologist who dealt with in a very ancient way. I used to preface the material by emphasizing that her husband, Louis Leakey, LSB Leakey, of course, was always promotion-minded and really was the world-famous front for their endeavor, that he thought of himself as an African. And his autobiography, in fact, is entitled White African. And Leakey was born of missionary parents in Kenya, and he was a tribal member. He was actually tribal. He was Kikuyu. And when Leakey went to England to go to university, he was shocked one day to realize that when he dreamed, he did not dream in English, but he dreamed in Kikuyu. And in order to satisfy a great deal of this odd interface between science and his tribe, Leakey devoted a number of years to doing a huge study that was not published until the 1980s, about 50 years after it was done, on the Kikuyu tribe. And he got special permission from the Kikuyu elders to conduct a very in-depth anthropological survey. And so what I'm trying to stress here is that Louis Leakey, though he looked white, though he spoke English, though he is famous as a scientist, was actually a tribal elder of an African tribe, the Kikuyu. In a way, Mary Leakey, who went to live with him, who devoted her life to his endeavors, who went to Africa, on one sense was like a very proper English girl who would have then been in a colonial position in Africa. And on one sociological level, you could see her in that way. In terms of the English girl who goes to Africa, she was dutifully initiated by almost dying several times from very severe illnesses. But I was trying to point out last week that Mary Leakey is a very different kind of person, not an English girl at all, not a colonial subject who innocently then went to Africa and was enveloped in the world of her husband, her man. On her own, Mary Leakey had several transformations with Paleolithic art. In the south of France, she was taken as a young girl and became sensitized to the very archaic world of man, the archaic levels of the psyche. And she felt at home with this. And she herself produced several volumes on prehistoric art in Africa, and studies on prehistoric art in England, and some work in France. In those encounters, instead of being ethnologically an English girl, she showed that she was a very ancient spirit. I don't mean to limit it to a sense that she's a reincarnation of some ancient person, but that her spiritual quality had an unbroken stream in it, which resurfaced and awoke again. And she was actually a very ancient being, is an ancient being, has an incredible affinity, not just with old things, and perhaps we should say not just with ancient things, but farther back, with even farther back than archaic. She has an affinity with millions of years ago. And she was able to pass this affinity on to one of her sons. Actually, all three of the sons had it more or less, but Richard Leakey, caught it from her and also has that talent. And the talent is to respond in a resonant way to material things that had a play in life millions of years ago. When she was first introduced to Old Duvai Gorge, within minutes, she found an artifact. And it was one of the most precious artifacts at the time of Paleolithic material. And it was about 20 years before another artifact was found at Old Duvai Gorge. She was the one, for instance, on one of the islands in Lake Victoria, Rusinga Island, who out in the field, characteristically she would go out alone with her Dalmatian dogs, and Lewis would stay behind in camp. And he would set up the tables to analyze and to record whatever she brought in. So she was the finder, not him. And it's almost like the most ancient strata of ritual. Before there were drums and dances, before that sort of thing happened, the most ancient ritual of all was a divination. And divination goes back many hundreds of thousands of years. And the classical divination was always that it took at least two people in order to make a divination. It took someone who could see what was there, and that person, we still use the Latin term for it, and the term is augur. It means someone who observes the oracular circumstance. And that person who observes the circumstance is always different from the person who interprets it. The interpreter has a different kind of mind. The augur, the observer, has a mind which is able to focus outwardly, whereas the interpreter has a mind that's able to focus inwardly. So that you have an hourglass kind of convection. One mind has this kind of concavity which produces a beam so that one can see exactly what is there. And an augur must have no associative, no imaginative fringes, but simply to be able to record exactly what is there. And this turns out to be, even though its origins go back several 100,000 years, it turns out to be the very first step in the scientific method. You have to have someone who can observe what is going on exactly, and to be able to limit themselves, to be specific, to be exacting, so that one can increasingly be observant and perceptual to an exactness that's increasingly refined, to be able to see exactly what's going on in this room, to see what exactly is going on in some chair, in one person, in one face, in exactly the expression of the moment, in the nanosecond of the glimpse, to be able to focus in like this. This mind, this mask of the brain, this arrangement of the pattern of the brain, obviates against interpretation. It doesn't work at all very well if you're trying to interpret at the same time. And this is one of the watersheds in the scientific method. Observation is in no way ever an interpretation. Never. So that in ancient divination, ancient magical practice, you have some of the origins of science. Now this auguring, this divination, is vision. It comes in vision. It doesn't come in ritual. In ritual, one does things. It's the action, the activity. But in vision, it's the consciousness of what you are doing. The self-consciousness of the perception is the beginnings of divination. It's also the beginnings of experimental science. Mary Leakey could do that. She could direct herself to an African landscape that she had never seen before, to strata which were millions of years old, and she could go exactly to the couple of little centimeters where a few teeth were and recognize these are teeth and pick them up. That's incredible. And on Rusinga Island in the middle of Lake Victoria, she was the first one to come across. She yelled to Lewis, who thought it's a poisonous snake or, who knows what. They came rushing pell-mell into the site, and there she was kneeling in this strata. And she literally said, "There's someone in here." And out came 3/4 of a skull of the first archaic link with our origins. They called the skeleton, they called that being proconsul in those days, Zinjanthropus. And she was the one that found it and pieced it together and took it off to England. It caused a worldwide sensation. Absolutely. Here was the face of primordial man millions of years ago. And though one found out later on, after a lot of experience in the field, that this was really more like an ape than a hominid, nevertheless, the face of Zinjanthropus is forever recorded as like the missing link. That somehow it is all true that we are an evolutionary product. We're not such a recent arrival. We were not hocus pocus created, but we were firmly, realistically brought into maturity out of great oceans of time, out of a universe of catastrophic existentiality, and that we are permanently real. We're not just a crossed fingers hope. We are permanently, eternally real. No way we can be erased. This is worth knowing. Now, Mary Leakey, in an odd way, just to show you how someone who has this talent, who has this magic, who has this auguring magic, when they pass it on to someone else, they get it complete. They get it whole. They don't get it just partially. It's like a musical tone which is whole, and you get it whole. And she was able to convey it not only to Richard, to her son Richard, who has it, who once was flying in an airplane over the vast expanse of the African, the southern Sudan, the northern part of Kenya, where Sudan and Kenya come together, in the great African Rift Valley, and from an airplane looked down and spotted an exact site on the edge of a lake where he knew there were remains of ancient Paleolithic man. They landed. I went to the site, and the Kubi Fora site has become world famous. He had this. He got it from Mary. But also one of his schoolmates got it from him. And sifting through some of the boxes 40 years after Mary Leakey and Louis Leakey had boxed up all these scraps of rock and seeds and who knows what, and sent it off to the British Museum as the context out of which Zinjanthropus was found. A classmate of Richard's sifting through one of these boxes that had bits of carapace of tortoise shell, and he noticed that a couple of little pieces were definitely not tortoise. They're definitely hominid, and brought those pieces out, showed them, and eventually they were found to be the missing pieces of the skull of Zinjanthropus that had been never put together for maybe 4 million years. So incredible precision. So someone who can augur like Mary Leakey, she can see exactly specifically what is here and recognize it, which shows that the auguring is visionary and not at all ritualistic. It's not at all natural. It is supernatural. I don't mean supernatural in a whoa. I learned that vowel from watching Cary Grant movies. Remember in Gunga Din where the elephant's trying to get on the bridge? Whoa. The augur can see on the basis of a transcendental conscious perception, which is vision, which is basis of magic, which is basis of science. Science and magic have the same basis. But it takes someone else, it takes a complement, it takes a pair, like a tuning fork, to make the whole thing work. One of them can see outwardly and focus outwardly, but it takes someone else to focus inwardly. And Niels Bohr is the kind of individual who could focus inwardly to the extent that Mary Leakey could focus outwardly. You get that? Okay, so we've got an hourglass, we've got Mary Leakey focusing out, and Niels Bohr focusing in. So the pair that I've chosen to begin science has a lot of pizzazz. It's not just a man and a woman. Oh, ain't that nice? No, it's more than that. It's that this shape of mind focuses outward and this shape of mind focuses inward. And that the next step in evolution is to have a pliable mind that can do both. And has never happened. Is an evolutionary jump. Is a mutation. Future being. Future beings are not in their spaceships. Future beings are in this tremendous realistic development where there will be a brain, a mind that is able to do what some of those new jet fighters do with the swept wings. In one position, they can rise right off the pad, and then they can sweep back and Mach 8. There will be minds like that. There'll be a few minds like that in the 21st century, and by the 22nd century, there'll be a population. And those people will go to the stars. Mankind will be out of the sandbox. Because the species can do a lot. You don't have to grow antennae. You can do a lot. What's interesting about this kind of activity is that a nuclear physicist has to has to be able to hold a theoretical focus and has a very difficult time holding any kind of experimental focus, which is why they're always fiddling with grants to buy equipment, and they need big grants because they don't know exactly what kind of equipment. It's very difficult. And they need the equipment to be that kind of exterior focus because they really don't have that, they don't have that talent. They shouldn't have that talent. Whereas someone who has that kind of talent to be able to see exactly what is there, they don't analyze. They don't bring the theoretical quality into focus. Now, there were two words in Greek that described this process. And these two words together, this process together as an ensemble, as a completeness, was first brought to human attention in a concerted way by Pythagoras about 2,500 years ago. Yes, he studied in Egypt for 22 years. He studied in ancient Iran for 11 years. He studied in his home Samos for many years. But mainly it was like Pythagoras was very, very wise. And he could, in a way, perform a little bit of both alternatively, but he focused on the interior quality. And the interiorization, the interior focus, the ancient word in Greek that was used for that was theoria, from which we get the English word theory. Now, theory has a sense for us that it's like a sketch, right? But for people who think that theories are like sketches, they're exterior people. They're people who are good at looking at the field out here. Whereas someone, theoria in Greek actually doesn't translate as theory, it translates as contemplation. That's what Greek theoria means. It means contemplation. It means being able to settle into the focus within. And somebody who can do that knows that you're not sketching. There's no sketch at all. It's instantaneous. A high-powered yogi doesn't guess. You don't have to guess. You know. And that's why the focus of contemplation is called gnosis. Whereas the exterior focus of knowing is called episteme, from which we get the English-Greek term epistemology, the study of knowledge. The study of knowledge of what's going on, what's out here. And there never was a gnosisology. Because interior focus, you don't have an ology. Episteme, you have to study. You have to portion it out. It gives way to mechanical distribution of stuff. Whereas gnosis is instantaneous. I mean, it's like style. You've either got it or not. So these two somehow go together, and Pythagoras was the one who saw that there is an underlying invisible structure in reality that links these two together. The world of episteme and the world of gnosis are linked together, and what links them together is a structure, an invisible structure called number. And that the understanding of this, of the motions of this structure, is called arithmetic, and the higher level of the understanding of this motion is called mathematics. Arithmetic is the basic epistemological structure of the outer world, Mathematics is the basic Gnostic structure of the inner world. And the linking of these two together is a great, huge discipline that no one ever said the name of. It's like the secret name of God, you don't name it. It's like the ancient Rosicrucian secret when somebody would take a Rosicrucian and put them on the torture rack and get them to tell the deepest secret of their secret order. And under torture, they would blurt it out and they would say, the life lived is the doctrine received. It's nothing other than that. What's the secret of your order? Well, it's the life you live. And in a way, this coordination of arithmetic and mathematics, of the motions and permutations and possibilities of number, the ratios, the fractions, the actuality of it, this play, this movement, makes a common structure of the inner and the outer world. But there's something odd about reality, is that it always has this watershed of, seemingly this watershed of, the perceptual rivers flow to this ocean, or at a certain threshold, they flow to that ocean. There's always a world out there. There's always a world in here. And though they're unified on a level of mystery that you can't name things. Now, it's very peculiar, but when we come to nuclear physics, when we come to someone like Niels Bohr, we just scratch the surface and we go in about 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, and we come back to this very same phenomena that I've been talking about, inner and outer, about ancient divination, the augurs being different from the interpreters, the mind that sees epistemologically has an arithmetic, mechanical quality of structure, which it needs. The mind which focuses within has an instantaneous Gnostic mathematic focus, which it needs. Let's try it. Let's see how quickly we get there. Okay, we come to our textbook that complements Mary Leakey's Disclosing the Past. Here's Niels Bohr's Times, the great physicist Abraham Pais, and we look at Bohr, and we come to the beginnings of his formation as a world-famous physicist, perhaps, along with Einstein, the most famous of all the 20th century physicists. And we see here that when Bohr was working on his PhD concerned the equality of metals. This was a long time ago. This is back in the early 20th century. The electron and its quality with metals, its movement. So that when he was working on this and got his dissertation together, the title of it was, he writes here, early in 1911, Bohr was ready. On April 12th, the thesis, written in Danish, was accepted by the faculty and defended for the doctor's degree. The defense took place May 13th, and Bohr successfully defended this thesis. And because he was working with electrons and metals, he went to graduate school in England. And he went to Cambridge first, because at Cambridge, the most famous individual of the day, named J.J. Thomson, who you probably haven't heard of, but a great deal of the practical application, electronics, owes all of its stuff to J.J. Thomson. Thomson was there at Cavendish, And if I can find where I've put the books, I have two of Thompson's early volumes. Just pass those over. The first of them that I want to show you is the one that is recorded as one of the great books of 20th century science. This was a series of 5 lectures given appropriately at the Benjamin Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. Why Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia? Because Franklin was the first great universal scientist to deal with electricity consciously. There were rare individuals before Franklin who dealt with universal problems in a mathematic sense, in a theoretical sense. Sir Isaac Newton, perhaps the most famous of them. And actually, before Newton, the real pioneer was Kepler. And Kepler's mathematical work was so astounding at its time that it scarcely made any impression on the society of its day. Everyone talks about how Copernicus showed that the sun was at the center of the movement of the planets rather than the Earth, and that the Copernican system is so great. Well, Aristarchus of Samos, some 2,000 years before that, had the heliocentric theory completely worked out with appropriate mathematics. It's really not that big a thing. Whereas Kepler understood, he was the first to understand and to be able to envision it and to theoretically write it out in mathematics, that the sun is not at the center of the star system either. Neither the Earth nor the sun. That they're simply a point in space of openness, and that that's the true center of the star system, and that the sun and the Earth revolve around this common mutual point, called in physics a barycenter. And that while the sun is so much more massive than the Earth, it's almost exactly at that barycenter, and the Earth is farther away. Nevertheless, the Earth and the sun both revolve around this common center, which is a mathematical, theoretical point only, and does not exist externally at all. And that when one understands that, that's why the orbits of the planets are not circular around the sun, but they're elliptical vis-a-vis the sun, but circular around the barycenter, the open space, the open focus in space. So Kepler was the first to understand that. And Newton, working on Kepler's work a century later, was able to take it further. And these are all theoretical, mathematical focuses, whereas Benjamin Franklin raised the external auguring to the precision reached by Kepler and Newton within. Franklin was not a mathematical genius, but he was an observational genius. He was one of the greatest augurs of all time, one of the greatest divination people of all time. He could see with such precision on such a universal scale that he was able to note this is exactly what's occurring. And both of those have to go together. And usually in science, the auguring comes before the theorizing. And only in very high avant-garde developments does the theory come first, and then you have to figure out experiments that are going to hold it together. So theory and experiment always go together. It's like Kepler. He would never have been able to develop his mathematics without the precise observations of a Dane named Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe, who was quite a character. He had a metal nose, and he convinced the king of Denmark to give him a whole island to build a utopian community called Uraniborg. And because it was supposed to be set up to be in tune with the universe, He built one of the world's first great accurate observational places. He took a cue from reports from the Chinese and from also the Arabic science. Actually, it was Mongolian, a man named Ulugh Beg, who in Samarkand in ancient times, about 800 years ago, had a 40-foot ark built where he could lay in this ark like a hammock, and he could accurately observe stars and observe the motions of the planets to within 1 or 2 decimal points of their actual motion in the sky. Well, Tycho Brahe did the same thing, and he was observing the moon, and he was observing Mars and the satellites of Jupiter, and he kept accurate tabulations of exactly where they were at exactly whatever hour and coordinated, but he didn't put together, because he was not theoretical, what all this meant. Whereas Kepler, when he brought his universal visionary magic to it, he looked at Kepler looked at the material and he saw patterns, and he developed a mathematics to be able to coordinate those patterns, and that's when he realized the orbits are not circles, they're ellipses. All of them are ellipses, which means that the center obviously is a shared center. That nothing just orbits around something else, that all matter shares a movement, and that this is the reality. Now, what to do with that, nobody was really sure. Newton took it as far as you could go, and mystical poetry late in Newton's life, like Wordsworth, was full of this romantic, wide-eyed possibilities, but who knew? Benjamin Franklin was the first to raise the level of observation to that level of exactness. And his work on electricity showed exactly that experimental science can be as painstakingly accurate as theoretical visioning. And that's why 1923, J.J. Thomson, lecturing on the electron in chemistry, went all the way to the Benjamin Franklin Institute in Philadelphia from the University of Cambridge to deliver, and here's the original book, The Electron in Chemistry. It's amazing because just 14 years before this, no one knew this. No one knew this material. No one knew about electrons, really, because in 1907, the same J.J. Thomson published in London The Corpuscular Theory of Matter. They didn't call them electrons, but corpuscle. From 1872 on, they were called corpuscles. They were called atoms of electricity that somehow accompany atoms of matter. It was the student of J.J. Thomson, Niels Bohr, who first provided a tremendous insight into the nature of electricity vis-a-vis metals, and the development that led to this was the painstaking quality of observation which J.J. Thomson was able to bring, like a Benjamin Franklin or a Mary Leakey, to the motion of this weird energy that would come in a cathode tube. And it was Bohr who was able to raise and coordinate his theorizing with J.J. Thomson's experimental focuses. And between 1907 and 1923, all of a sudden, like somebody who had blurred vision was able finally with both eyes to see together, and the reality of the atomic structure of the atom for the first time came into view. Notice that between 1907 and 1923 is World War I, right in the middle. That there's always a world catastrophe whenever man breaks a shell of universal ignorance. It's called apocalyptic millennial fever. And you got to be hell of a John Travolta to dance to that. I'm just going to read you a page. This is by Lord Rayleigh, who was a great physicist in his own right. He talks about the way in which this weird energy was first seen and first understood about 100 years ago. He says, let us suppose that you are not familiar with cathode rays. And he says that the cathode originated by a German named Cathode, the name for the man. Let us suppose the electric discharge of high tension to pass through, he uses the phrase, a highly exhausted space. That means a vacuum. All right? Let us suppose the electric charge, the pizzazz, is going through a vacuum, using as the negative electrode a flat metal disc. We shall see that an influence is propagated normally from this flat cathode, in some respects reminiscent on a small scale of a beam from a searchlight, for its track is marked out by a blue luminous haze, and it produces a patch of light when it comes up against the wall of the glass tube. So there on the glass tube, you see this glow, just as the searchlight does when it comes against a cloud. If the cathode is concave, the beam converges to a focus. Remember the mind? The epistemological mind? If it's convex, it diverges. The direction is independent of the other part, the anode. The cathode sends it, the anode receives, independent of that, which may be placed on one side or may be a plate with a hole suitably placed through which the beam will pass. This beam, or pencil, constitutes the cathode rays. So you get this blue pencil of beam going. But it differs from a searchlight beam in a strikingly peculiar and particular manner, because it can be bent when you bring a magnet near it. And if you put the magnet so that the magnetic lines are perpendicular to this blue haze beam, the beam will bend at right angles to itself and right angles to the magnetic field. So that the magnetic field is an energy going one way, the beam propagation going another way, and they have this cross energy, and the resultant is a third direction perpendicular to both. It was the first time, this is about 100 years ago, when human beings began to see that there's some kind of universal pattern going on here. What it was, they were not sure, except that the atoms of electricity somehow are influenced by a magnetic field. So electricity and magnetism somehow jibe together. We know now that they're two aspects of the same thing. They always go together. They are only real when they are together. And that the electrical oscillation, they're never just statically there. Nothing ever is statically there. You want to talk about being practical? Well, the ultimate practicality is nothing is as it seems. Nada. It's always vibrating, it's always moving, and the electrical has two aspects. It has a very large oscillation and a very small little complement of another energy, whereas the magnetic has just the opposite. It has very small oscillation and a very big complement. And they always go together. They're always linked together. So electromagnetism, you can hyphenate it, but it's even closer than that. And if you turned electromagnetism, which goes out like this, if you brought it within, you would have magnetoelectric. So that epistemologically, the universe looks like it's electromagnetic, but in contemplation, it looks like it's magnetic electrical. Except that the energy frequency of magnetoelectric energy is about 10 billion times what the physical universe is. So that if you were a form a contemplative spiritual form, you could walk not only through walls, but you could walk through universes and never touch anything. Because the physical universe is too clumsy and too awkwardly large. Let me quote Richard Feynman, if you expanded an atom to the size of this room, the nucleus of the atom would be a speck of dust floating somewhere out near the center. All the rest of the atom is empty. So it's not difficult for spirits to walk through walls at all, or anything. Neutron stars, nothing. Black holes, nothing. Doorways. So you don't have to worry about it. It's 100% out of your hands. Let's take a break. Let's come back exactly where we were. I was reading to you from Lord Raleigh's biography of Sir J.J. Thomson, vis-a-vis the electron, and that vis-a-vis Niels Bohr, and Bohr as a theoretical genius, different from an observational genius like Mary Leakey. An observational genius has the kind of mind that's shaped so that the beam of focus goes out. A theoretical genius has the shape of mind so that the beam of focus goes within. And that one of the next evolutionary stages for mankind is to have a pliable mind so that the same person will be able to see with equal accuracy. As it is, there have always had to be pairs. Benjamin Franklin's genius at seeing the world the way it really is, seeing how mankind really are, how individual human beings really operate, had to be complemented by a theoretical genius like Thomas Jefferson. Franklin would never have been able to do the theoretical work, but Jefferson's theoretical work would never have been able to be done without Franklin's practicae. And here the second Greek word, the first Greek word was theoria, from which we get theory, but actually in translation means contemplation. Theoria in Greek means very much the same that in Sanskrit dhyana means. Dhyana means concentration, sometimes translated as meditation. So contemplation, meditation, concentration. Dhyana, pronounced in Chinese, the Sanskrit pronounced in Chinese is Chan, and pronounced in Japanese is Zen. So Zen. Zen is no theory at all, zero theory. No mind. It's not the theory of no mind, it's the practice of no mind. That's what D.T. Suzuki's book is, the Zen practice of no mind. When you are precisely knowing the world as it is, your inner world doesn't occur at all. It's still invisibly there, linked by a very arcane mystery that links arithmetic with mathematics, but it doesn't function. It's not operating. It's in pure, exact neutral. Which is why yogis do not have two-valued logic. They don't have true and false. They have three-valued logic: true, false, and neutral. And someone like Niels Bohr, any modern physicist always has a three-value logic. But the three-value logic is not from a theoretical standpoint alone, but also from an experimental practical standpoint, because the two are brought together. The sigma particles are negative, positive, and zero. The W particles come in 3 values. And though there are basic pairs of matter and antimatter, there are neutral particles that are their own antiparticle. And there's no way to imagine this because the imagination is derived from the epistemological view that focuses out. And if you have imagination functioning in the inner world, it blurs the mind so that the mind doesn't really function. It just apes and imitates. It imitates what perception does. And so you have an imitation mind. And most of the people walking around on the planet today are just spiritual cripples. God save them. Because their whole development, their whole internal world is an imitation of perception. And that is fantasy. It's fluff. It's nothing at all. And education that promotes this is actually evil. What? Evil. And so there are spirit warriors that fight against this, who come in with little Krishna-type bows and arrows and shoot the eyes out of the lie. And when the work is done, take the badge off and throw it in the dust and ride off with the girl. You've seen that movie. And it happens at 0 time, right? High noon. This whole double paired quality applies especially to the root of reality. It's not only that the mind with a certain shape focuses without and the mind with a complementary shape focuses within. It's that everything that is made by the patterns of that focus have those qualities. So that at the very root, the most fundamental particle that physics deals with is the photon, the basic unit of light. And it not only is a toss-up, is light a particle or a wave, but in a 3-value logic, one understands that it is precisely a particle and a wave and both exactly together. That's a mature consciousness. On that basis, 21st century physics is way ahead of 20th century physics. Monumental difference. But in order to have a single individual who can appreciate that, you have to have, first of all, an educational system that develops a pliable mind. And that's what this is. We don't make steel dishes that point to someone out there telling you what you are. Nor do we make little spiderweb dishes pointing within so that the old archetypes can tell you who you are. Both tyrannies are over. And they're over forever. Because the mature, pliable mind is able to see with both eyes and get a depth perception of what's real. And on that basis, men and women can do a lot. This whole notion of particle and wave, inner and outer, what is it? This whole conundrum of subject-object, this whole split, this whole polarity, this whole dualism, this whole right or wrong, yes or no, that entire entourage of deception has very deep origins and surfaced again in physics 100 years ago. And here in Lord Raleigh's little biography of Sir J.J. Thomson, flimsy little book that came out in 1942, about the time that London was just being blitzed by the V-2 rockets. They managed to publish this. And here is Lord Rayleigh writing again. Rayleigh was the head of the Cavendish laboratory before J.J. Thomson, and that's where a lot of this work was done. He writes, talking about cathode rays, talking about how that blue haze pencil beam of cathode rays, of pure, not corpuscles, the rays and their particles, the corpuscles, they're the electron. The electron stream can be deflected by magnetic beams, and they go right angles if placed just right. There were two schools of thought about the nature of cathode rays. It may be said broadly that the English school considered them to be corpuscular, carrying a charge of electricity, an atom of electricity. The English mind, the English language mind, considered them to be particles. And that the German school considered them to be of the nature of a wave propagation. So this whole thing of whether light is a particle or a wave is phenomenally sociologically interesting in that it was German mind and English mind. The Germans saw them as waves, the English saw them as particles. It was amazing. Because the English mind is very good at epistemological focuses, whereas the German language mind is very good at gnosis focus. The German language mind hones very well to theory. Einstein, right? The whole list of nuclear physicists looks like a German telephone book. Was the famous phrase about our getting the atomic bomb? Our Germans were better than their Germans. Whereas the English are wonderfully obtuse about theory. I love the English. Some of my best friends are English. They're wonderfully obtuse about theory. Let's see what happens. Let's experiment. Let's see what goes on. And in that case, light is a particle. But when you're theorizing on, no, it's a wave. And so the compromise is uncertainty. And the uncertainty is not a confusion, but it is a form of zero neutral based. So when one talks about 20th century physics, the famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle, Heisenberg was a student of Bohr. There was no fuzziness to the uncertainty about Heisenberg, because there was no uncertainty to the neutral of the way in which Niels Bohr was able to use his mind in a very interesting way. His theoretical focus was able to be brought almost to the surface, so that it took very little effort then for someone who experimentally was able to bring his mind almost to the surface, so that almost instead of having the two concave and convex polarities, you had two disks that were able to anneal and become a two-sided coin. This happened in the early 1920s. Very few people, but a few people were able to get together and understand what you're seeing and what I'm thinking about are the same thing. And out of that comes something like J.J. Thomson's wonderful lectures at the Benjamin Franklin Institute in Philadelphia on the electron and chemistry. And one has here this beautiful chapters, 5 chapters, and the very first one is the arrangement of electrons in the atom, the conditions for stability. And as soon as the electron was seen as the negative quality of an atom which had positive and also neutral, there were electrons, negative, there were protons, positive, and there were neutrons, negative, and those three, a 3-value logic, atomic structure for the first time came realistically into view. Before then, it was not realistic. No one really got it. Finally, they got it, and the fundamental atomic structure was seen as 3-value. And it's very difficult to separate a neutron from a proton. Their weight is almost the same. And what is their weight? Their weight is not measured in pounds. Well, they're just little minuscule. There's no way you can use pounds or ounces or grams or anything. Their weight is in electrical energy, mass measured in energy. And the difference between a proton and a neutron is about 10 out of nearly 1,000. Something like 983 and 973. 1/10 of 1% difference. And that somehow then the atomic structure was visualized in this 3-valued logic, and as soon as that was done, as soon as that coin of the realm of truth was reached, and one understood that the face of the world was backed by the inscription on the theory, and that those somehow were the same thing, a whole membrane of reality suddenly was available for a few minds to permeate. Not just to penetrate. No. Sorry. Wrong image. Not to penetrate, but to permeate. Osmosis, right? A membrane. To go back and forth. And to see that experiment and theory, when they work together in a balanced way, what advances is the realistic whole. And that's a quality of 20th century science that is absolutely phenomenal. And in the 75 years that that's been available to us, we have jumped light years beyond whatever was there. Ladies and gentlemen, they were still riding horses in the street in 1910. We're talking about analyzing starlight billions of years away and seeing the signature of sodium here or there. We're talking about a major jump. We're talking about mutation. But it's very difficult for a single individual to do both angles. Why? Because the educational pattern is not able to permit that to grow, to happen, to mature. It doesn't happen. The miseducational is almost 100%. And life is very peculiar. Mother Nature is very, very giving, but she is god-awful strict at the same time. If you have a capacity that you have developed and don't use it, she kicks the shit out of you. Why did you go to all this trouble to develop this capacity, to strain the whole universe so that you flower, and then you don't flower? You remain in closed buds. And that's why the apocalyptic fever in the world at this time, because we're not blossoming, and we earned the right to blossom, and so all that energy is backing up. And it will back up till it's terminal. Mother Nature gets rid of whole species that way. She X'd out the dinosaurs that had been around for a couple 100 million years. Nobody's tougher than dinosaurs. You want to clean out a bar? You take a T-Rex. I don't care how many fraternity boys and how much they've had to drink. They're not going to hold up. She X'd them out in a whiff. Gone. So the imperative on us is we have earned the blossoming. We have to blossom. She's not going to let us go back. And there's going to be no blossoming without a completely new educational pattern. None. You can revise the old one forever. It's never going to work. Why? Because it does not have that kind of interface where the theoria and the practice are developed together, so that the pliableness of the mind. This education does that. You may not know that, but when you go to look at something, you'll see more, and if you want to think about it, you'll have the capacity to think it. Or if you want to think something through, you can do so, and if you want to apply it, you can. And you'll see as time goes on that more and more you have this ambidextrousness. You can bring together your conscious world of your person in this transcendent spiritual cosmos and have it permeate and interface with the mechanical world where you have to get things done. That's what all this is about. It's about this completely. And what comes out of a meshing of the inner vision and the outer practice is the revelation that there are whole forms of matter and whole levels of energy that have always been there, possible, and never were brought into play before. Something new under the sun? You betcha. Example. We've known for a long time about diamonds being the hardest natural occurring substance, much harder than steel. Steel's a sponge compared to diamonds. We've known for about 100 years that diamonds are made out of carbon. We know that carbon also occurs in a form called graphite, like the lead in pencils. And we know that somehow carbon atoms are a part of life. Now, if you look at a molecule of water, H2O, two hydrogen atoms in white and a red oxygen, there's no carbon. In water, there's no carbon. But as soon as this liquid, essential to life, is transformed into, this is a molecule of ethanol, and we say, well, water is necessary for life. Well, you cannot have any life without the alcohols. Sorry, temperance people. Sorry, but organic molecules do not work without alcohols. Sugars are made so that alcohols can be distilled out of them. That's how the cells work, folks. Sucrose, yep, sugars. All cells are candy bar addicts. They always deal with sucrose because they have to. That's the only way they can make ionic changes. That's how the body works. Water has no carbon, but ethanol has a linking central spinal column of carbon, so that all organic life is carbon-based. Remember the Star Trek movie where the alien called them carbon units? Yeah. Why is the Enterprise infested with carbon units? Because the structure that makes organic life possible at all has a spinal column of carbon. And when you get to the higher levels of molecular structure that deal with higher potentials of life, the benzene ring, which takes a simple pair of carbon atoms and arranges them as 6 carbon atoms. And when you have 6 carbon atoms in a benzene ring like this, actually in reality, they're not a flat plane, it's sort of puckered. It's sort of crimped like that. That's what they would look like if you could see them. Notice here that the movement from water to benzene is monumental jump in structure. Water is essential to life, but the higher organic life requires carbon. What's the point of all this? The point is that diamonds and graphite are carbon. They're pure carbon. And about 10 years ago, they were the only universal forms of carbon known, pure. Carbon is either sooty black or it's sparkling diamond. That's all it is. And about 10 years ago, a new form of carbon was found. They're called fullerenes, named for Buckminster Fuller. They were once called Buckminster fullerenes, and now they're just called fullerenes. It's a form of carbon that was never seen before. Graphite is certain structure of carbon. Diamonds, much more condensed lattice carbon structure. Fullerenes are so much more dense than diamonds that it's unbelievable. They have 60 atoms minimally and up to maybe 520 atoms per molecule. Can you imagine a molecule that has 520 carbon atoms arranged in these buckyball type structures, complete geodesic dome structures? Only spiritually mature people would ever have seen this. You're saying that these scientists are like super yogis? Yeah, they are, but they don't know it. Few of them know it. Few of them, like Niels Bohr and Einstein, they were starting to get it. They were starting to get it. When Niels Bohr tried to talk to Winston Churchill in 1944 about the dangers of a world where atomic energy was available to man, Churchill, deigning to see him for just a few moments, scolded him like a schoolboy for corresponding with scientists in Russia. Threw him out. Whereas Roosevelt said he was one of the most interesting men he's ever met. And they used Bohr because when the Manhattan Project got to a certain crisis, there was no way to have an ignition switch for the atomic bomb. And it was Bohr's insight that provided the intelligence, theoretically, to understand and how to apply it so that there was an ignition switch so that atomic energy actually switches on and off because of Bohr's slight little contribution. But he had that kind of universal genius. Not a schoolboy to be scolded by a bulldog politician. And had Roosevelt not have died, we would have had a whole different scene. But unfortunately, a few months later, he was dead. Bohr's quality comes out in this fullerene aspect of carbon. Mary Leakey's reality comes into play because she knows how to apply this and see a structure of life in a very practical way. Mary Leakey is one of the few people on the planet who has a working, everyday knowledge of tremendous range of man going back millions of years. She sees human beings like us in context of exoteric structure of millions of years. And to her, it's an everyday reality, a thought process which is so familiar to her, she knows it like the back of her hand. There are very few human beings who have that quality. She's in her 80s now, and some of her really great work is yet to come, to be published, to put out. When you look at discovering the past and you see the way in which Mary Leakey looked as a young girl and the way that she looks in later life, you get a tremendous realization of the journey that she's taken. Here's Mary Leakey, age 4. No one could be a more prim little English girl, like a Frances Hodgson Burnett child. And here's the cigar-smoking octogenarian, right? An African toughie, able to hold her own with the Mau-Maus and the diseases and the, as Stravinsky says, the great sin of our time is non-acknowledgement. Bohr and Leakey together are these two qualities that in the 20th century have been raised to literally astronomical levels. Her ability to see in a resonant landscape the precise site, the precise little speck. Once when they were assembling the skull of Zinjanthropus back in the late 40s, one tiny little fragment, just a little speck of the shell, fell into the dust of the tent floor. And she was the one just patiently, hour after hour after hour, to find that speck and all the specks of dust. And because it was an essential part to make two plates come together just right so that one could get the angle of the arch, which gave the whole shape then to the skull. And no one had ever seen skulls like this. They hadn't existed for 4 or 5 million years. She has that ability, that it's more than tenacity. It is an auguring, divination quality to be able to resonate with the reality of the world. And Bohr's ability to resonate with the inner world. And these two qualities together make it possible in the late 20th century to finally envision a cosmic form of man. You don't have to wait for the UFO overlords to come in and give you a ticket so you can be free to go. If anyone's issuing tickets, it's the species on this planet when they're really mature. We're pitching. Yeah. That's what's so special. From the orbit of Neptune, the Earth looks like a blue star gleaming. It looks almost like Sirius, the great star Sirius. It has that kind of penetration. How do you know? Because Voyager, looking back from the orbit of Neptune, photographing the Earth, there it was. It looked like a sapphire in the velvet enormousness of space. And so our planet is not just some little throwaway. It's a real jewel in the cosmos and really stands out. So what we do has importance. It has this kind of efficacy. Now we're going to come back next week and look again at Bohr and Mary Leakey deeper. We're going to look at theory and practice deeper. We're going to look at science deeper. But at the same time, we realize that our method of working here has a deep efficacy. And part of its efficacy is to be able, at this conscious state, to look forward a little bit and to incorporate materials that we haven't yet got to into what we're doing now. Now that sounds like magic double talk. And on tribal level, it would be magic double talk. But on this level of transcendent spirituality, it's everyday occurrence. Working the future into the present is a part of masterful weaving that goes on. And the craftspeople on level of stellar civilization always weave future into present, just like the past. So that we're not limited by the physical direction of time. We're not limited by the past conditioning a precarious present. By working the future in at the same time, we get a fabric which is called eternity. And that's what a spirit wisdom tradition is all about, is getting us used to wearing the clothes of eternity rather than the conditions of ignorance. That's what it's all about. And when you say it this way, right away you can see that there's a whole different aspect at play here. The next pair of books in science, the future, coming up 3 weeks from today, the next pair of books already we have to take into consideration. The next pair of books are going to be, one of them is a bestseller from Kip Thorne over at Caltech, Black Holes and Time Warps. And the other, The Conscious Universe, by great astronomer Minos Kafatos. Conscious Universe and Black Holes and Time Warps. So what you want to do in order to weave this fabric together is you want to go out and get yourself a couple copies. A copy of each of these. You may not have done that so far in the course. Go out ahead of time and get these together and put them together. Hold these together as a pair and try something. Try just being with this pair and try intuiting, not in an external way, because we haven't got there epistemologically. We haven't got there yet in terms of the outer practical application. But try meditating, try contemplating with them. What can occur within you, in your concentration, in your dhyana, in your zen? What can occur in you that comes out? Will they be intuitions? Will they be dreams? Will they be visions? Will there be nothing? There's a whole spectrum, a whole range. But it will be interesting to you, in terms of science, to do this little experiment. Try it. Make the experiment. Can something that we know nothing about, have never touched before, is at least 3 weeks into the future, in a practical epistemological way, can that have any kind of resonance contemplatively within us? The answer is unequivocally yes. And so we will next week talk about Bohr and Leakey, Mary Leakey and Niels Bohr, in such a way that that pair begins to resonate with this pair, though we will not be able to confirm it until 2 more weeks go by. And will it be just my stylizing it? No, because we're going to make it a real interesting situation here. You take whatever you can from today's lecture about Bohr and Leakey, whatever it is that you take away from here, and you make a notation down for yourself, write it, of what it is that is a focus of your understanding of today's lecture. Whatever it is, however little, however much. The only criteria is that it must be written, because a conscious language is written. And with that written summation of whatever you got today, towards the end of next week, Friday night, sometime during Friday evening, Friday night, you read that over again and you write down whatever occurs to you. Now you can sit in meditation to have whatever occurs to you. You can just do it Zen-like spontaneous, but you write it down and you bring it here next Saturday and just hold it. These are your cards, right? The blackjack dealer here has dealt everybody a hand. And you'll have 2 pieces of writing. And then I'll give a spontaneous lecture next Saturday, and let's see what happens. Let's see what resonates. You want to see big magic? $25 a head. Cheap. Let's see what happens. Because the educational process now has a kind of a dynamic to it. What kind of a dynamic does it have? I'm going to quote a presentation that Richard Feynman gave at Caltech about 35 years ago. Everyone knows that gases, when they expand, they cool, and when they come together, they get hotter. They build heat, condensation. That's why, like in an automobile or any kind of an engine, you have pistons to confine the gas. So when the gas gets hot, it's confined by the piston, and the only place it can go is to push the upper part of the piston. But an interesting thing happens. It's a law of physics. That in this pressure, when the piston is released like that and comes back in its downward swing, it increases the pressure more because the basis at which it was keeps raising, and so the piston builds an ongoing dynamic kind of a pressure. It's a principle of a dynamo. It happens in electrical engines and mechanical engines. All mechanical activity builds like that so that you have an ongoing account of energy. And if you do this rapidly enough, instead of getting a kind of jerky increment, more and more it statistically averages out to a kind of a push. That's why when you rev a supercar and the pistons work so many times a second, dozens, hundreds of times per second, you don't feel the little explosions. All you feel is the statistical continuity of the push, the acceleration. A similar thing happens in terms of using consciousness. Instead of just having little fits and spurts, images that pop in and pop out, glimpses, glints here or there. That's just one motion of a single piston. But when consciousness begins to be trained and educated, so that all of the cylinders are working, and they raise themselves to an optimum tuning, and then the push that comes, instead of being just a glimpse here and there, becomes like a panorama that shames CinemaScope, is a panorama that shames perception. The veils of perception are drawn aside, and one for the first time is able to see. Now, what does one see? That the scale of reality is astounding, absolutely astounding. That the tapestry of the dress of Mother Nature is unbelievable, and her dance gorgeous. And we are her children. We're not only having the right to dance, but we're invited. And to be a wallflower back in ignorance is just a crying shame. And so the invitation here can be confirmed. Try this written experiment vis-a-vis our books. But notice, if you do not get your textbooks, if you just imagine that you got them, instead of working in a positive way, it's going to work in a negative way. You're going to sink into illusion more. So I guess you get a choice. You can either ignore it completely or you can do it, but don't do it halfway. Don't do it wrong. This is not an age where teacher plays, master. Forget that. No one needs that. But this is an age where you remind yourself whether you're living for real or just sketching. You can keep sketching. That's your right. No one is going to interfere with that here. But there's an invitation here to a dance. That's fantastic. I mean, the combo is tops. So try this if you can. There should be copies of these around in paperback. I saw at Borders a couple of copies of this in several branches of Borders, The Conscious Universe. Part of going out to get this material is the adventure of going to get it. Notice that in a science experiment, everything is important, including the observer. So you want to be keeping conscious track of yourself at the same time as trying to find these things. Keep conscious track of that process and of yourself in that process. Science on this level begins to have a revelatory quality. Prophecy, the level of prophecy is like a mud puddle compared to great huge waves of revelation that comes from cosmic seeing. I mean, the most that prophecy can do, let's take great Nostradamus. He sees time events for this planet 400 years into the future. With cosmic vision, one can see billions of light years where there are huge bubbles of space 400 million years across, surrounded by great gobs of galactic structures that arc. And from the other side of one of those great bubble voids, one couldn't even see the Milky Way galaxy, much less this star system, much less this planet, which is the limit of Nostradamus's prophecy. So we're talking here about stop being fascinated by the mud puddles and learn to look up with that kind of balanced vision and see with your full capacity within the full capacity without. And when you do, you realize that we are indeed winged spirits, absolutely free. There's not a single string attached anywhere. It's the most remarkable thing. We're actually not only free to go, but free to go together. More next week.